Okay, you're on.
Okay.
Take it away.
Thank you very much. Ready to go?
Ready.
Okay. Right. Good evening. I'm Dr. Karen Lawson,
I'm Michelle Renee.
and we're really pleased to welcome you to our presentation tonight on the TENDing method, a trauma-informed path through long COVID and ME CFS, and to thank Guy and Fran for having us this evening. So thank you guys.
Yes, thank you so much. So to go a little further in introducing ourselves, Dr. Karen, I will let you introduce first. Oh,
Advance our slides would be really great, except nothing's happening. Speaking of editing, it worked before.
So go ahead and just click back, right?
Okay.
battery problem?
No,
The light is coming
Nope.
on. Oh,
it just,
I
Yeah.
aimed it up at the ceiling and that worked.
Okay.
So we'll just aim it at the ceiling. Okay.
don't know what that was, but
Okay.
carry on.
Carry on? Okay. So I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Karen Lawson. I am a recovering physician, family medicine by first training, then emergency medicine. Have been in the integrative and holistic healthcare field for going on too many decades to count. And these days I see myself as predominantly an integrative health and wellness coach and a health empowerment specialist. So I work with clients and individuals around all kinds of health challenges, both helping them navigate the complex system that we have, but also really helping them figure out what they can do for themselves and how they're going to do it. Putting together plans, action plans, implementation plans for the things that they can do to help be responsible for their own health. And that fits in really well with the TENDing method that we'll be talking about further tonight. So, Michelle.
Well, so I am Dr. Michelle Renee, and I have been in holistic healthcare for a very long time now. I started out as a massage therapist in 1998, and then became a chiropractor in 2008 because I wanted to talk to people about diet and lifestyle. I wanted to work more holistically with my clients and my patients. At that time, I started working for Northwestern Health Sciences University and continued my education, got a master's in acupuncture, and very nearly completed, I was in my very last class, in a master's in applied nutrition. So, next slide, if you would, Karen. The reason that I didn't complete that master's degree in that very final class is that that's when COVID hit. 2020, I got COVID in September. I was not hospitalized, but I was really sick. Pretty much that was the sickest that I had ever been. And discovered in the weeks after I thought I had recovered this story that we now know fairly well, that I really didn't recover. The fatigue remained, and I had this whole host of really confusing, seemingly unrelated symptoms that didn't make any sense. So that was in fall of 2020, and I continue to struggle with those symptoms today. It was so severe that I had to withdraw from that master's program, and for a period of time I was 100% disabled, and have slowly worked my way back to working about half of what I had been working before that. So it really took me down. I did all kinds of testing and discovered that I had an old case of Lyme disease, so a chronic Lyme infection that I didn't know about, that we now know that long COVID inflames and aggravates in many people, that I had rheumatoid arthritis that hadn't been diagnosed previously, but it inflamed that condition, did all kinds of holistic testing and discovered that I had a mold toxicity and some environmental toxicities, and just a huge range of things, which is exactly how it happens really for people who have this kind of condition, if they're lucky enough to get to a holistic provider that can do that kind of testing. And if not, what we find is a lot of mainstream medical providers who, through no fault of their own, don't know what to do with this condition because we don't understand it. All we can do is symptom management. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's how we arrived here. And over these years of my struggling with this condition, what I decided was, well, you know, now that millions and millions of people, we think maybe 20% of the American population is struggling with some degree of this condition, maybe I, with my knowledge of holistic healthcare, can help other people learn how to live well with this condition. We don't know how to cure it, but maybe it's not all about curing. Maybe it's about rethinking, reimagining how we understand ourselves and reconnect with ourselves. So that's how I came to Dr. Karen. We've known each other for a really long time, and we were just catching up one day and got on the topic of this idea, and she was gracious enough to say, yes, let's do this together. So I'm so excited about that because I think we have some really complementary skills, and we've been doing collaborative care together for a very long time. So it's really, really fun to be able to tackle this project together.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yes.
Yes, I was going to count the years, but then I decided that was depressing, so I decided not to do that. That's right. And, you know, she said something that's really important, is that there's a lot of perception, particularly I think in the general population, that there's nothing I can do. You know, I'm kind of a victim to this. And information is one thing that helps people. Shared lived experience, hearing from somebody, is another thing. And then also finding out what are they empowered to be able to do themselves, right? So if you're listening to this, you're here in our audience, you might have heard that there's nothing more we can do. And whether you're a practitioner or you're a patient, you know, that's a phrase we should just ban from our vocabulary entirely. We should leave that out because there's always something to do, and it doesn't have to be about a cure. It can really be about how are we approaching the healing process of this. How are we approaching empowering people to be able to live with and through the challenge of this, and really creating a different relationship to the difficulties that they're having. One of the things I do just want to mention vocabulary-wise before we get a whole lot farther, because I always struggle with this as a physician turned coach. When I was a physician, I had patients. As a coach, I have clients. If I'm talking to doctors, I want to talk about patients. If I'm talking to somebody else, I want to talk about clients. So we're going to use those words interchangeably tonight. We don't mean for the patient word to be disempowering at all, but the client word doesn't resonate with everyone. So just so you know, our language isn't perfect, and we're going to justify it right now before we go any further. So let's see. Kind of alluded to the fact that sometimes our perspective around the challenges that we're dealing with are what causes our difficulty. And one of the challenges I've seen over and over again with clients is this perception that symptoms are always something bad. They're always something to get rid of because we don't like them, right? They can be uncomfortable, they can interfere with our lives. We just get rid of them. If we change that perspective to understand that those symptoms are our bodies, our minds, our hearts talking to us, and we learn how to listen, we can develop a different relationship with those symptoms. Becomes really important. So at the end of our talk today, we're hoping that you really leave with some kind of a mechanistic framework to think about what's going on. We're going to talk a little bit about the nervous system dysregulation. Certainly that will link in very well to the work that Fran and Guy are doing with direct nervous system modulation. We want to talk about a structured model, for patient education and some daily self-regulation support, because that becomes so critical. We don't want to necessarily say we're eliminating or judging all the symptoms, but we have to enable people to feel like they can live their lives as positively as possible. We want to also relay some of the understanding about how hypervigilance kind of amplifies the dysfunction. And when you know, it's kind of like what you put your energy into, you get more of. And so there's a fine line sometimes between when we're attending to something and when we're hyper-focusing on it. I think that becomes really important. And then we'd like to give you one clinical referral pathway that you, if you are practitioners and watching this, that you can use the very next day. So I'm going to turn this over to you.
So the next topic we want to talk about is why these conditions are so hard to treat. And I say conditions for a couple of reasons. One is we are talking about long COVID, ME, CFS, myalgic encephalitis, and chronic fatigue syndrome. But these concepts really apply to any condition that is that the medical establishment has a hard time addressing, that is chronic in nature, that continues to affect people day to day. So it's not really about the diagnosis. It's about how that dysregulation affects the body and how it affects our day-to-day lives, right? That's really what we want to talk about, and the system underneath it. So that's what we want to focus on for today. And go to our next one. We have some sense of what generally is happening with long COVID, which is a lot more than we knew for that first couple of years. We've put together a list here for you, and that gives us some ideas of where to begin. And I think a lot of people who are challenged by these types of conditions haven't even seen this kind of information. So it is something, at least for people, to begin learning about their bodies and how they operate. These are all very much interconnected systems. So a disrupted microbiome, what we now know with long COVID in particular is that the virus comes and kind of punches holes in the microbiome, devastates some of the bacterial strains that are in there. Mast cell activation syndrome. So maybe somebody's had hypersensitivity to the environment for all their lives. It really cranks it up when people get these kinds of post-viral syndromes. So now they get a diagnosis like mast cell activation syndrome, where many foods put the body into an attack that could result in even in an anaphylactic type of attack. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that severe. I myself am really managing my symptoms right now by eliminating a whole host of foods that are high histamine foods. That leaves me with a very narrow diet, which is not that much fun, but it does help me be functional every day. So I'm kind of willing to live like that for right now. So that's a picture of what that mast cell activation syndrome piece looks like. Then the hormonal dysregulation, which, as we know, is a very complex system where we can't just look at reproductive hormones. We can't just look at stress hormones. We have to really look at a full panel of hormones in the body and the interrelatedness of those and see how they're showing up as an entire picture. Then we've got the endothelial and microcirculatory dysfunction. You may have heard early on in the story of COVID that people were having more strokes, that they were having more clots. And what we now know is that a lot of people who have long COVID and this range of post-viral syndromes are having microclots. And it's making not only is it making the blood sticky, but anywhere we have kind of a network of tissue in the body, those microclots are getting caught up in that mesh. You could think of it like a fishnet, and it's making that fishnet like a no longer penetrable. And then that's creating some of the systems. So that's a part of it. Dysautonomia is just to say that the nervous system is no longer able to regulate itself like it's supposed to. You can maybe see right now that my face is getting very red. That's because I have a real difficulty regulating my body temperature. So anytime there's any stress to my body, I have this immense flushing, which actually is also partly a histamine response. That's all due to that dysautonomia piece. So it affects sleeping, it affects eating, it affects digestion, it affects so many things in life. And then the mitochondrial dysfunction is fundamentally responsible for the fatigue which is one of the top 3 symptoms that people have in these types of conditions. And that's why it often gets kind of lumped in with myalgic encephalitis and chronic fatigue syndrome. So that was a lot of information, but all that to say, it's a really complicated picture, and every individual has a different, if you could put these all into a pie, and then people could color in how much of those they have in their syndrome, every person would have a different picture. And that leads to the complexity of treating this well, right? Lots of complicated things to look at. Each and every one of them very difficult to treat in and of themselves, much less when you look at them together.
It's complicated.
Long story short, it's complicated.
I heard about mitochondrial dysfunction, so would you like to rest for just a minute?
I would actually.
Okay,
I'm going to do that.
So here's the reality is that, in all of this, your brain is literally sounding an alarm. And so your body, your nervous system is going on that hyper alert, whether for you it's fight or flight or it's freeze. I don't know if many people go to the befriending part. I don't think they have energy for that. And it's not about anxiety. It's really about the fact that your nervous system is stuck in this kind of high, hyperactive, hypervigilant kind of state. It's a survival response. And that becomes really important. And sometimes one of the challenges is when our nervous system goes to a place it's been before, it can recognize this as familiar, which means if you've had any instances in your past, whether they be illnesses or insults or injuries that have caused any trauma to your nervous system, the body now goes to a place that's familiar that can kind of reignite that traumatic memory, which kind of can cycle things even worse and pulling you out of that present moment, putting you back into that fight or flight place of a past trauma. So I think for the practitioners who are caring for people dealing with this complex of illnesses is to be aware and to kind of be looking for when those past traumas can be there and when they have to be addressed as well, because they can really make a bad situation worse. Yeah. All right, you rested long enough.
All right, so a little more about hypervigilance. When the sense of protection becomes a problem is how we've titled this. Some people are really caught in that state of hypervigilance long before they might get an illness like this. As a matter of fact, we're beginning to think that the previous trauma that people have experienced predisposed them to this condition. One of the studies that we found that was really interesting talked about that the number of percentage of people who have chronic post-traumatic stress disorder from a previous trauma is higher in people with long COVID than it is with people who have been diagnosed with myalgic encephalitis chronic fatigue syndrome, by about double. So that's a really significant number, and I wonder if that's partly because of this hypervigilant piece. People have learned how to live in that state of hypervigilance. That dysregulates the immune system and the hormonal system in the first place, maybe predisposing them to having this post-viral syndrome after they have an infection like long COVID. So there's this sustained cortisol, catecholamine, and we know that that can only go on for so long. So we are seeing that a lot of people who have these kinds of post-viral syndromes have a flat picture when we look at their stress hormones. They just can no longer create any. There's lots of reasons why that might be happening, but really interesting, dysregulating the immune surveillance, and then that continues to happen long after the viral infection is gone. Now it's just the spike protein that's hanging out and continuing to devastate the immune system is what we're learning over time. We've got the mast cells expressing those CRH receptors, that signaling of the degranulation, so we've got that constant immune response and hypersensitivity to the world. Again, these people probably had some degree of that before, and now it's just much worse. Pain is a huge problem for a lot of people who have long COVID and myalgic encephalitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, And many of these folks also have a diagnosis of chronic pain, thank you. Various chronic pain syndromes. So, lots of people need a range of things to learn how to manage that pain, because those, the input to the nervous system becomes very distracting, of having all of these various, maybe they're having muscle pain, maybe they're also having various kinds of neuropathy, maybe they're also having chronic migraine. So it leaves the body in this sort of pain, fatigue, cognitive symptom complex that's really complicated, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides.
Okay.
Yep, all set.
I'll come over here, switch up here, baby. Okay. So as we already alluded to, trauma isn't just what happened before, it's also what happened and got stuck. And so whether that was a physical injury, an infection, surgery, some kind of emotional trauma, and I think one of the things I find really important when I work with students to remind them is this trauma is in the eye of the person that happens to. An external observer might not think that experience was traumatic, but if the person experiences it traumatic, whatever it was, it has that same impact on their nervous system. So I think it's really important that we think about our language, coming back to vocabulary again. I've seen too often practitioners, not just physicians, but practitioners be kind of dismissive. Oh, that's just your anxiety flaring up. Or they'll say something like, well, you're the sickest patient I've ever seen. I don't think I'm going to be able to help you with this, right? And our words are seeds, and our seeds plant future, right? Future seedlings that are going to come up, right? Future things that are going to come up. And we don't want them to be weeds. We want them to be healing plants. And so I think it's really important, whether you're a patient or a client that suffers from one of these ailments yourself, or you're a practitioner that works with clients, or both, as Michelle is, you may be a provider who's also suffered from this yourself, to really think about not even just your spoken language, but what are the thoughts and the beliefs that you're planning, because those thoughts and beliefs become reality. And so I think it's really important, if we're going to work with the nervous system, that we really work with it at as many different levels as we can, including our conscious efforts to use spoken language and the language in our beliefs to lay the seeds for potential healing work.
Love that. So next we'll talk about managing symptoms. Managing symptoms is not the same thing as healing. However, I will say that managing symptoms does sometimes allow our clients, our patients, the folks we're working with, to be able to have more presence with themselves and to be able to find a pathway forward. Most treatment strategies are looking at symptoms and not necessarily at the whole system. So it's important for us, one of the things that we really wanted to do in this program, in the tending method, is to help people think about their whole selves, to think about who they are in their immediate environment, in their larger environment, think about the people in their lives, think about their bodies as whole beings. Most of what people access around healthcare is the mainstream medical model. And the mainstream medical model is reductionistic, right? It's designed to look at individual systems. So for example, I said earlier, I have rheumatoid arthritis, so I have these very severe migraine headaches, so I've got a neurologist and I've got a rheumatologist, right? And each one of them is looking at their little lanes. Specialists might be better or worse at being able to think holistically about the body. My rheumatologist doesn't want to talk about anything except for what he's doing in rheumatology. He's like, there's no conversation. He's really great about asking how I am and my family and all that, but other than that, he's staying in his lane. My neurologist, really fantastic about thinking about the big picture with my health, but she only has 2 minutes to spend with me, right? So in the tending method, and maybe depending upon what you're doing with your patients and clients, it's really important to be able to take the time to contextualize with people what is happening, what the symptoms mean what their environment might have to do with that, what their choices are. People feel very disempowered, I think, with these kinds of conditions. And this idea of suppressing the signals or just treating the symptoms and never discussing the larger picture is really problematic for people. And it keeps people from hearing what the body is trying to say. And so this program is all about helping people learn how to listen to the messages, as well as identify how to navigate turning down those signals once they've heard them. So I have a couple of metaphors in healing that I wanted to share with you that I have learned along the way in my journey with long COVID, Lyme disease, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. I went to see an occupational therapist once upon a time, about 3 years ago. And I guess before I went to see her, I didn't fully understand what occupational therapists do, but they are amazing practitioners. They do such good work. And one of the things that she helped me understand is that the brain is like a stovetop. And maybe a person who is able to function at a really high level and is able to multitask really well and get a lot of things done, has a healthy brain, might have 9 burners on that stovetop, right? So her analogy was maybe pre-COVID, I had 9 burners, let's say. But once I came to see her, I maybe had 3 or 4 left because the illness, the inflammation in my brain had kind of wiped a few of them out. And what she helped me understand in terms of brain fog, which was and is one of my most challenging symptoms, is that the pain I was experiencing, the anxiety I was experiencing, the grief I was experiencing from kind of losing my life, at least temporarily, to this illness, the dizziness I was experiencing, all of these things that I was navigating each day were occupying those burners. And what she helped me understand was that as each burner was taken and maybe even the pain was boiling over onto another burner, that this was creating more and more brain fog for me. So I might say, I'm handling the pain fine. This is what I would say to her, right? Like, 'cause I'm one of those people who's like, yeah, pain doesn't bug me that much. And she would say, you think it's not bugging you that much, but you're telling me you have this significant brain fog. Why don't you try controlling the pain? Try some new strategies for controlling the pain, see if the brain fog gets better. And just to acknowledge via this analogy of the stovetop that each of the things that my brain is trying to sort out, to process, is reducing my brain's capacity to just do day-to-day life. She also suggested to me to only do half of what I thought I could do on a given day, or even in a given hour, because I was wildly an overachiever before. I don't know if you caught on to that by way of my degrees, but she said, if you're looking at even the next hour, think about what you can possibly do, cut that in half, and then go lie down after you finish that half, and then reassess. Or when you're looking at the whole day, you can do the same thing with it. That was a very helpful tool because it built in time for my brain and my body to recuperate on a regular and frequent basis, which if you're dealing with a condition like this, you really need. Then the third thing that I'll mention here is that she had a graph, and so a box, and at about the 20% mark there was a line, and she said, tell me what happens to your body when you get to that, when your energy drops to that 20% mark, what happens? What do you notice? And I said, I collapse. And she said, like, I can't function anymore. She said, no, that's when you're down at the bottom part. What happens when you're at the 20%? She helped me sort of step back enough to notice what are the very first things that show up so that I could stop and take care of myself and recuperate some of that energy so that I never dropped below the 20%. That was a big piece of the strategy that she offered me. So some practical examples of those effects on stimuli, the stovetop, think about this for the stovetop. What I have learned over time is that stimuli means something very different to my brain now than it did prior to this illness. And I noticed very early on that even going to the grocery store was very difficult for me. In fact, it was about 3 years I just couldn't do it. At all. Or if I did, I had to go in, get one thing, check out, and out the door I went, and it took up half of my energy for the day to do that. She helped me understand that the reason that was so difficult was because of the bright lights. If you go into my home or my workspace, my office, any of those spaces, I have very low lighting in all of those spaces, and it's very quiet, very relaxing, because the bright lights are taxing. And the noise in the grocery store is taxing. And there are so many people. And I'm navigating things. And I am trying to make decisions. And there are smells, right? Like all of those pieces of stimuli are very overwhelming. The second little anecdote that I'll share with you is maybe 2 years into the illness, I got well enough that I thought I could go get a pedicure. I was very excited about this because I really missed doing those kinds of things for myself, right? So I went foolishly by myself because I love doing things by myself, by the way, and I don't like asking for help, furthermore. So went to the pedicure, to the nail salon by myself, got my nails done. It was wonderful, but I was definitely very overwhelmed and got up at the end and it was time to pay and she told me how much it was. And I couldn't remember how to pay her. Like I had money with me, I had cash, I had cards, and I just couldn't remember how to do it. Like I just had to pause for 5 minutes or so, and I don't know how I wound up remembering how to do it, but it was very difficult. And I walked out of the nail salon and I got in my car and I sat there and cried for, I don't know, 10 minutes or something, because I just thought, how did I go from being this like very competent person to I don't know how to pay for a thing? It was very bizarre, but it had to do with, it was just too much stimuli for me, and I need to ask for help, right? I need to get people to drive me places, and I need people to maybe help me navigate. So I call those people my chaperones.
I'm going to remind you about the just asking for help part.
Great.
Part of what Michelle's talking about is that obviously the brain and the nervous system is a big piece of this, but that holistic view and how we really think about the whole thing is so important, and we can't just think about it from the neck up. That just doesn't work. And I've worked with people who are kind of trying to think their way out of it and not incorporating the rest of their experience as beings, as human beings. So it's really important that we think about that. The other thing, and some of this I'm sure is cultural, it would be fascinating to hear about how long COVID's being experienced in other countries. In Minnesota, particularly, and I will own this, particularly women, we're really good at making sure that we take care of everybody else's needs before our own. It's a cultural thing here. I've lived in 4 states in the Midwest. I find it pretty common across the Midwest, and I know it's true in other places. But shifting that perspective to recognize that it's not selfish to take care of one's own needs so that you have the energy and you have the brain space to be able to do what you need to do. And then that piece of asking for help that Michelle alluded to, which many of us are not very good at in this culture, and how important that is. And so it's a shift in mindset, and it's really enabling people to give themselves permission to take the time to empty some of the burners, to allow themselves the space and the support and resources that they need to really be able to function, and to work through the guilt, the disappointment, the frustration, and all the emotional experiences that come with that. And I think that becomes something that as a healthcare system, we don't always attend to those kinds of emotional experiences very well, and those things can really get in the way of our healing. So, yeah. Are you rested?
I'm rested.
Okay.
So what does it mean to tend? Um, we tend to be so process oriented, so much thinking about doing things. There's that saying, we are not human doings, we are human beings, right? And healing is really about that. It's a garden to tend. It looks different from one season to the next. It looks different from one day to the next. It requires that patience and attention. And we just really need to be able to pay attention to what is actually happening, right? Not what we think should be happening, not what was happening yesterday, not what we planned, right? We need to be able to think of what is actually happening. What is going on around us? What is the weather doing? What is the environment doing? And to that point, weather is has a huge impact on people who have these kinds of issues. And it isn't something we often think about in the healthcare system, but it's really significant to think about how the environment might be impacting how we feel. It's not always a part of our plan. So we've got the tending method, just to kind of get down to what the program is. The T is for tune in, the E is for engage the nervous system, the N is for nourish, and the D is for direct your path. And we'll just say another thing or two about each one of them. So the tune in part is to pay attention to what is actually happening in your body and what's happening in your clinical foundation as you think about how you're taking care of yourself, because we all have to own that. So helping people connect with their bodies and learn how to, many people don't have that skill, so we teach it in the program and talk about how the body is communicating. Then we have E, engage the nervous system, creating conditions for regulation. And so this is the body-based system that helps to support the dysregulated system, helping to engage the parasympathetic nervous system so that people can rest and digest, breath work, movement, touch, etc. Teaching people some daily habits that they can take into their lives. Then we have the nourish piece, building the foundation and not just filling the tank. So not just putting miscellaneous calories in there, but really thinking about how do we make the best choices we can for what is happening? How do we support that mitochondrial function the best we can? Focusing on restorative rest. Just because people are sleeping doesn't mean that they are really resting deeply. And how do we make sure that people have nourishing relationships? How do they make the most of those connections, that community around them? That's a super important piece. And then the D, directing your path. We have really disempowered patients in mainstream medicine, and maybe even beyond mainstream medicine. So this program is really designed to help people understand how they can take ownership and create their healthcare team around them, engage their community of people that they have in their lives to support their well-being, and to just confirm for them that they are the experts in their health, right? They're the only ones who really know what it feels like to be in their body. That's a really important piece.
So this may go without saying, but we're going to say it. You need a team. You need a healing team. If you're going to do this work, you not only need the support of your friends and family, but you need a team. And while everybody doesn't have 4 different kinds of practitioners in one human being, like Michelle is, it's important to be invited to think about what are the range of things that might be helpful to me. You're going to be hearing from a guy about neurofeedback, neurostimulation, those kinds of direct brain things that addresses directly the brain dysregulated patterns. But also think about, are there symptoms, are there issues that you're having that acupuncture, the traditional Chinese medicine might be helping for, that chiropractic or other body work might be helpful for, fascial, deep tissue work, craniosacral, things that many people might not have ever even considered in their practices or in their healthcare teams before they really became ill. And then if you're a provider, it's important to think about, well, what's the patient education that needs to happen, and what's the support and the range of opportunities you need to present to your patients in order to really support them. And that's challenging in mainstream healthcare. And one of the things is like, well, why don't we start with the mindset? I alluded to that a little bit before when I talked about our language and planting seeds and why that's so important. But we need to be thinking about, if you think about building that foundation from the bottom, we are working with the body, working up through the nervous system, and then adding into how do we nourish it, how do we flourish it, and then how do we really have agency for people to take control. And that's one of the areas that I'm really passionate about, having watched many, many people over decades be really disempowered by the healthcare system. How do we really enable people to find their agency and to find their voice? And recognizing that the body is still going to work at safety first before growth. And so we need to keep people above the 20% burnout place before we get it. And then just to honestly recognize this is not a straight line. No real healing work is. This is a spiral, which means that there's going to be ups and downs and going backwards sometimes. And it's really important, I think, that we normalize that for people, because otherwise it's really easy to feel, if I'm going backwards, like I'm hopeless, I'm never going to go forward. So how do you really let people know this is expected, it's okay, you can still take one step backwards and two steps forwards, and that's a normal part of the healing process. So the program that actually Michelle and I have the pleasure of offering, we just want to allude to here so that people know that it's a resource for you. We have 6 weeks. It's a foundational program. It's virtual, it's online, it's in a group setting to build community. And the first couple weeks, we really talk about safety and somatic awareness. The second 3 weeks, it's more about engaging your nervous system and also those body-based practices. Then there's kind of an optional part 2 of the group if people are interested and would like to continue doing that. That's an expansion. We get into more details about nutrition, rest, resources, and really your pacing and your agency over time. So the next offering of this group is coming up the 31st of March of this year. And encourage people to let folks that you know that may be suffering from these illnesses that it might be something that can be helpful to you. And I think this one's you, dear.
Okay.
Or wherever up.
Yeah, we're nearing the end here. So to think about, what changes and how, right? That's the big question that a lot of people have. So learning how to pause before we react, learning how to pay attention to those nervous system shifts, right? The reason this hypervigilance piece happens with these kinds of illnesses is that the body's having trouble regulating, so we have to support it a little bit more, and that happens by paying attention. Moving away from why is this happening to me to what is this telling me, right? That requires this level of tune-in that most of us have never really had to do. The body does it automatically, and now we have to pay a little more attention. And then this is a really important one, arriving at our clinical visits really prepared, more regulated, more articulate, more adherent. We probably need to bring people with us to our visits. We need to bring paper. We need to be prepared with that paper so that we can really harvest more of what we need from our medical team. And it also helps them be able to help us. So that's a really important piece. I love this concept of the tending method gives people the tools to come home to themselves. I mentioned earlier about feeling like, that grief of feeling like I had lost myself somehow. And it really very much did feel that way. I think many people have this experience. So to help people reconnect, to help them rediscover themselves, to come home is the way we talk about it. And having other people who are experiencing a similar experience is really important. Finding that community, because most people who are going through this are really going through it alone. And no one around them knows anything about it. And so it's very important to find that kind of symmetry and to be able to learn with and from each other, even if our experiences are different, and to learn from those body rhythms that we're looking for.
So I think in interest of time this evening, and because I would like to get on to what our experts and hosts are going to say, we're going to skip our experience. But just let you know that if you would like information to continue the journey, there are ways here that you can access us. There's email and websites to continue the journey. And we have one other participant on our team who brings some expertise, is a non-force chiropractor and a specialist in neurologic healing, who you may also encounter if you do some work with us. So with that, I think I would like to turn the baton over to our marvelous host. And thank you very much.
Nothing with that.
Have a stick.
Imagine all the applause. Well done.
Thanks. Oh, thank you, forgot.
Glasses?
Oh, those are mine, thank you. So glad I can see. You're gonna see. Yes.
Okay, so Fran, if you want to, how's it looking online? Did I get everything set the way it's supposed to be set? So, okay. Great, so I'm Guy Shah with Bhakti Brain Health Clinic, and we're going to be talking about chronic conditions tonight. So you guys did a fantastic job introducing the topics and giving a great description, one of the best descriptions that I've heard. And I often feel like a lot of the nuance gets lost, but you communicated the nuance very effectively. So I'm going to skip over my usual part of digging into that to bring it forward. So this is just a little bit about us. It's always helpful for people who are in the neurotherapy field when they see who we studied with and what kind of equipment we use. It tells them a lot about who we are, what we do, how we treat, and all of that. So I always like to one of the biggest questions we get is there research? Yes. So we're now up to almost 4 million studies on electrical stimulation. That seems like enough, right? But it's amazing how much that number's gone up since we've been doing this part of the presentation. It's gone up almost 500,000. So here are some studies that are broken out a little bit more into categories to kind of show the number of studies in kind of what areas, what kind of studies, to give a sense, again, that there is research. What we're going to talk about tonight is evidence-based. It is not just what Fran and Guy imagine that we do and make up, although that could happen too. So tonight what I'm going to talk about is kind of a bioelectric medicine in particular. For us, that's more in the form of neurotherapy. And this idea of how do we address what I will refer to generically as central sensitization. So I would say most of the things that we've heard about so far could fit under that umbrella. So that could be also expanding it to things like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, things of that nature, along with chronic fatigue. Long COVID is still kind of new to have factored into the kind of the umbrella of central sensitization. So I do still kind of leave it as a over here as its own thing. But those other conditions, mast cell, those all come under the umbrella of central sensitization. So that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about is central sensitization. Because a person can certainly have something like fibromyalgia or a mast cell or a chronic fatigue, but not have central sensitization. It's a bit of a spectrum. It's coming underneath the definition of central sensitization says something about how far into the condition one is. Like how much has the body lost the plot? That's what tells you how far along and when you come underneath. So classic, when I'm taking a history and I hear somebody say, well, usually they'll run down, they have pain, they have chronic fatigue, they tend to have allergies, environmental allergies, food sensitivities, they go down the list. We get enough of these things. Then usually I'll ask a few questions just to kind of see if I've dialed in, which would be, are you the kind of person that tends to abreact to medications? Often yes. Are you the kind of person that abreacts to supplements? There it's maybe a little bit more nuanced and we have to have a little conversation, but in the end, the answer is yes. And then it'll be, are you the kind of person that can abreact to acupuncture, massage, chiropractic? The answer is yes. That's central sensitization. And that is a system that can't take a nutrient, whatever the nutrient is, could be a massage, could be a supplement, whatever the nutrient is, the body can't use it because the information processing system is what's broken down, the logic system. So even though it may be an appropriately assessed need and an appropriate dose given, the body has lost the plot on how to put it to use, and a person has an abreaction. And that abreaction is usually a roller coaster, which is something works for a while, feels I'm getting better, and then that same thing delivered in the same way gives me symptoms, I get worse. And then you keep filling in the different things, and the person is on a roller coaster, and it doesn't matter what they do. Eat this, don't eat these. Take this supplement, don't take this supplement. Take this medication, don't take this medication. Have an adjustment, don't get an adjustment, get a massage. It doesn't matter, they do this. Right? That's really the definition. That's the person that is central sensitization. And that's who is going to kind of benefit most from what I'm talking about. Not that anybody who, again, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, you could be anywhere on that, but maybe not to fully sensitized. These things still fit, but it's a whole different ballgame when we get into central sensitization. So that's primarily what I'm focusing on, is this idea of working with the information processing system. Right? So a lot of this work comes out of Michael Levin's work at Tufts University. There's a few other, Carl Friston, his work, Earl Miller at MIT. So these are some of the people whose research that I draw on to kind of fill out the idea of central sensitization. That model's been around for about 20 years, but it came out of allopathic medicine and mostly has stayed there. But some of this more recent research has really taken that model and built it out and made it much more useful from a treatment standpoint. Not just an understanding, like an idea of what's going on, that's helpful, but to actually be able to help somebody. And for me, the goal isn't management, it's resolution. That's the measure of how successful the treatment plan is. Are we moving to resolution as opposed to we have a good management plan? If we end up at management, fine, but the goal for me is always resolution. So in the world of bioelectric medicine, it's looking at treating the body or interacting, engaging the body from a level of intelligence, right? So it's Michael Levin's theory of TAME, technological approach to mind everywhere, which is just saying on every level there is mind. So whether we're talking about chemical level, biochemical level, cellular, tissue, organ system, autonomic nervous system, central nervous system, brain, mind, at all levels there's mind, there's a subject there. So what we have here is a little model that shows the agent. So I wanted to pick kind of a generic word that kind of ties in with our world of AI. And there's actually some of the stuff that's happening with AI is directly informing these models and helping them build them out even faster. Because we're seeing a similarity between a cell as an agent and an agent as we think of it within the AI world. And so there's this information that's going back and forth between biology and AI has been really fascinating to watch. So the basic idea here of what's called active inference, this idea of predictive processing, that every agent, so a cell, a tissue, like a blood vessel, an organ, your liver, a system of organs, right, all the way up to the brain and mind, that agent, let's say like when I say I'm always doing predictive processing. I'm taking in all of the information. The information is from the outside world, but it's also from my history. Those are being combined. I predict what's going to happen. If my prediction matches the world, we call that success. That was a good prediction. Did not predict that. See? But then what we have right there is, error checking, which now tells me, don't squeeze the clicker. Now I know. So we have our future and our past, and the environment and behavior, and that's always going through a continuous process. Right? And that's what's happening again in this idea of body, the intelligence of the body, that our cells have intelligence. They're not just set doing one thing all the time, as Western medicine would tell us, that we operate more like a machine, that it's just reliable, they always do the same thing all the time. But this model says no, that every level has agency and has a problem-solving ability and can arrive at a goal through novel paths. Bioelectric medicine tries to leverage that like we do with software in a computer. So to talk a little bit more about that, so here what we're looking at is kind of, as we take this one model, here one agent, and here now I've just added in 3 agents, so we've gone from a cell to a blood vessel to a liver. So each one of those has agency and an intelligence, but the liver's intelligence is formed by all of its constituent parts. So it has pulled together all of those intelligences, but its intelligence is more than the sum of its parts. So then you have a liver intelligence. You listen to this close enough, it starts to sound like Chinese medicine, because you have liver qi. Qi isn't just energy, qi is intelligence. Right? So they understood thousands of years ago that there was an intelligence you could work with. So here we've scaled it up. Now the agent, in this case, is the autonomic nervous system. You talked about, one of your slides had dysautonomia on there, right? So we could say the agent of the autonomic nervous system has lost the plot. It no longer can do its job effectively. So think thermostat in your house. Instead of controlling the temperature narrowly, it has a wide spectrum, and your heating and cooling are running extra hard. Your house is ranging 20 degrees of temperature. Right? So think that same thing happening in your body. Your blood sugar levels are going too much, too high, too low. Thermal regulation, hormone levels, digestion, water levels, kidneys taking too much out, not enough out. So you've got all of these functions that are not following a tight set point. We start to get chaos. Right? So this is part of the idea of what's happening in central sensitization. We scale this up. Now it's looking at the brain as an agent. So we're a little more familiar with that as an idea. Like I think of like me, maybe I probably think more about my mind, like I am my mind. But most people, it's just one step back and they can go like, yeah, well, I'm my brain, right? Yep. Harder to say I'm my autonomic nervous system. So the I, is a little bit higher in the hierarchy. So what you had talked about interoception, right? So that's this idea of extending the I down into the body and understanding that part of the thing that makes up the I is also the sensations, the information that I can get through interoception. So that the agents get more complex, and as they get more complex, they have more moving parts. But more of those moving parts start to lose the plot a little bit, and then all of a sudden, this agent of the brain, it doesn't really know what's going on. Right? It's getting misinformation coming up, then it's trying to control things, so it's sending information down, but it's bad information. So it's telling the parts to do things that are the wrong things. Now they're misled, so they're sending back up information. So to kind of give this an example would be something like in fibromyalgia. So fibromyalgia can have this thing. There's a lot of components to it. This is just one of many. So you can have what's called nociceptive conversion. So you can have cells out here at the end that are just detector cells. They normally detect touch, let's say. We'll just talk about our touch receptors. Those receptors can just send a touch signal to the spine, but if you have central sensitization, that touch signal gets amplified, sent up to the brain decodes that as pain. It then says, oh goodness, there's pain out there, so I'm going to have an immune response and send inflammatory things, and now all of a sudden there's an inflammatory response out here at the periphery, but there's actually no problem, right? It was just touch. But now you have inflammation. So now you have, when you get touched again, you have amplification out here because of the sensitization. So now it is a stronger signal that gets amplified in the spine, that goes up to the brain, and the brain goes, oh my God, it's even worse. Tighten the muscles, send some more inflammation. You get this cycle going, and it's all misinformation. None of that response is going to lead to a good outcome, because it's just tail chasing and problem causing, not solving. Right? So this is what's happening in central sensitization. So what do we want to do is we want to help the body realize that that was just touch. So the normal pathway happens and not the sensitized abnormal pathway. So here we're just saying we can take this all the way down to the level of the gap junction at the cell. Right, so you could think computer, and in a computer you've got bits, you've got little gates, right? And in the body we have gap junctions. Those are kind of our bits that are either on or off, and from there we can build almost anything. Not anything yet, but that's coming. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So we can see a similar thing can happen. Again, you talked about mitochondria. Mitochondrial dysfunction is common across all of these conditions, so we see it in central sensitization. So the mitochondria are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. We think of them as the power plant of the cell, right? They produce ATP, that's the energy, sure. But research telling us now that maybe more important than that is they do cell-to-cell signaling, right? So they're communicating. So if you have, let's say in the brain, you're going to have a volley of neural activity going over there. So someplace over in my hippocampus, there's a signal coming. The mitochondria are letting those neurons know ahead of time so that there's more blood and more ATP produced so that those neurons can fire. So the mitochondria are doing that cell-to-cell signaling. So if our mitochondria are affected, it isn't just our energy, it's communication at the base, like subcellular level. Intracellular communication could be thrown off when our mitochondria aren't working properly. So here's one of my favorite slides. Packed a lot of information. This is from Earl Miller at MIT. He studies brains. Absolutely fascinating guy. Encourage anybody to go listen to an Earl Miller talk. You can't help but love him. So what they're saying here is they're showing that this little here idea is these are local field potentials. So these are firing patterns of neurons that make an electrical field. That's what we study in EEG. We're reading that local field potential. Roughly correlate that with the mind, but I won't get too concretized on that. But what he's shown in his research is, so those brain waves can actually have an effect on the neuron, like on the cell of body of the neuron, and change what's happening at a genetic, epigenetic, metabolic level in the cell. And that can change the firing pattern, which can change the brain waves. So he's shown that you have a complete communication loop from electrical signal to the cell to when that neuron either fires more or fires less, overfires, underfires, whatever we have. But if we have a normalizing, right, that's what we want. So we've got a circuit there all the way around in a circle. Same thing is happening in the body. The body, our cells produce an electrical field that can be measured just like brainwaves can be measured. We're not good at it. We're going to look at a little bit of data, but we're much further ahead on doing this with the brain. But the exact same concept applies to the body, where we can measure bodily electric activity, and then we can interact with that bodily electric activity to change the pattern of the electrical activity all the way down to the genetic gene regulatory networks in the cell, and everything in between, the behavior of the tissue. So we do have access to that information processing system that goes from the top to the bottom and the bottom back up to the top. Bioelectric medicine is about where do we intervene and what's the conversation we're having. So here's some of Michael Levin's stuff. So we get into a little bit of like what's he showing in bioelectric medicine. So this is about 15 years of research on the screen here. So what do we have? Over here, we have a frog or a tadpole face. It looks like a picture of the anatomy of a tadpole. It is not the picture of the anatomy of the tadpole. That is calcium ion channel imaging. That is the electromagnetic template for where the face will eventually be. There's no anatomy there yet. That's where when cells migrate to that area, they will receive electromagnetically the instruction that will tell them what kind of cell to become. So, idea being, if you can interact with on that level, you can change what happens at that site, right? And he's gone on to show that he can do that. Here's an example of a tumor. So he's able to, by changing the bioelectric field, make a tumor appear or make a tumor disappear by electrically connecting cells. Disconnect them, you get a tumor. Reconnect them, you get normal tissue. Over here, he's using bioelectric medicine to grow an ectopic eye. So this is just skin cells, would not normally grow an eye, but he's able to change or put in the bioelectric signal for basically a subroutine call that is grow an eye here. So all he has to do is put in that signal and it will start to convert those skin cells to eye cells. He does not need to micromanage it. He doesn't need to say, I need a lens here and a cornea here and a retina here and an optic nerve here. Nope. Once he says grow an eye here, the organism has the intelligence of how to grow an eye. It just sets about growing an eye. Often we'll wire it into the spinal cord and that eye works. So you can have a tadpole with an eye on its tail and it can see. So that's there. Another interesting thing is it doesn't always work. The skin cells can kind of argue and say, no, we're skin. There's not supposed to be an eye here. I checked the plan, no eye here. They'll recruit those cells that are becoming eye cells back into becoming skin cells. So you'll get a normal skin. Sometimes the eye cells win, you get an eye. So they're still working out the side that they're both agents and they can't make them do it. It's a negotiation. They have to talk him into it. He calls it somatic psychiatry. I love that. Here, frog, right? So frogs don't regenerate, but they're able to amputate a frog leg, turn on the subroutine for grow a leg here, and it will grow a perfectly normal frog leg. It takes about 18 months. The normal time that it would take a frog to grow a leg. It doesn't go any faster. It's not magic. It's just biology. But the thing is, they don't have to micromanage it, right? It grows all of the parts originally. It stops when a normal frog leg is there, and it's a perfectly functional leg. They've done, so this frog here actually has its own leg, but they've done the same thing where they've grown like a fifth leg by just telling the cells next to it, grow a leg here, and away they go. Here, two-headed worm. So they take a worm that has the head and the tail. They induce in it through bioelectric medicine a body memory saying you actually have two heads. As long as that worm is fine and not injured, goes around, lives as if it has a head and a tail. You take it and you cut it, it regenerates two parts. The two parts have two heads. So he's able to implant a counterfactual memory that does not become true until there's an injury. Think about that. Like the significance of what that means and tells us about the very topic we're talking about tonight. So down here, so this is Pavlov, the dogs, the food, the bell, get the dog to salivate. These are gene regulatory networks. He's shown in his research that a gene regulatory network has about 5 different types of learning, one of which is classical operant conditioning. So they're doing work where they will sensitize a network to with using a drug, but then placebo and paired drug, placebo, till they can get the same response by giving the placebo. right? So goal being is you give somebody a drug for a while, you can remove the drug, you can give them the placebo, and you can get the effect. So absolutely phenomenal research that he's doing, and really proof of concept. So our version of that is, so up here, EEG and audiovisual entrainment. So if we wanted to induce more alpha waves in our client, we would use an audiovisual entrainment device set to alpha, and that would produce more alpha waves. So that's what you can see right here. So this is actually Fran's brain, right? This is, oh, this is Adam's? Adam's. This is Fran manipulating Adam. Yes. So this is Adam's brain.
Okay.
So we wanted Adam to have more alpha, and so he's audiovisual trained, and sure enough, we get large alpha. So there's all kinds of effects of like what alpha has. Alpha is kind of a neutral offline communication to the brain. So we're talking to the brain in the language of the brain, saying, hey, we want you to have more alpha. So we're able to help take that brain into more of an alpha state, kind of an offline resting attention. Right? So then here, so this is kind of a classic, this is independent component analysis, kind of looking at EEG. This is a classic kind of anxiety, like a treatment-resistant anxiety pattern. This happens to be happening in the posterior cingulate. Posterior cingulate is core to much of what you guys were talking about, is how the backside of the brain takes interoceptive information, labels it as with whatever the feeling tag that goes on it before it goes to the front of the brain to the executive function of how do I think about how I feel. So somebody who has significant dysregulation back here, those signals that are coming up are getting misinterpreted and then sent to the front of the brain. The front of the brain is getting bad information. It might be working perfectly fine, but it's getting bad information, so it sends bad information back down into the body to regulate the system. So from our standpoint, we see somebody who has this dysregulation in that posterior cingulate. We're going to do neurofeedback or neurostimulation to re-regulate the neural activity in that area so that that system can take that interoceptive information, process it, tag it with the proper feeling, so it goes to the executive functions and gets coded in the way that it should. So we correct the information processing system to sort out the disinformation that has been moving through it. Similarly here, so we're looking at heart rate variability, autonomic nervous system. So we can, again, we can read the system, see what's dysregulated, what part of the dysregulated, we can retrain that system. So we can help that autonomic nervous system. So again, I used the idea of the thermostat that had lost the plot. It had a plus or minus 10-degree swing. So that's your autonomic nervous system if you have dysautonomia. We speak the language of the autonomic nervous system to have a conversation to talk it back into and remind it of what its natural endogenous function of regulation is. We can take immensely dysregulated systems in a relatively short period of time, bring them back to regulated. Absolutely remarkable how quickly it can work. It can really be hours for people that have taken, decades of dysregulation, and in hours re-regulate them and see them go on living, kind of normal, symptom-free. So here, some fMRI study that a friend of mine did. So this is using neuromodulation. So this is a vagal stimulation, and what we see basically, so this is a before, this is a during, this is an after. The green is good, just to keep it simple. Oxygenation. So just a simple 5-minute stimulation, vagal nerve stimulation, increased oxygenation during, and then 5 minutes later it was still elevated. So just showing, again, how talking to the body and helping these systems find their way back to their endogenous normal can have a profound effect where what was dysregulated just becomes regulated, and we get information instead of disinformation into the system. Here, this is one of the most exciting pieces of research that was done. So we have glial cells. So glial cells in the brain, it turns out they actually, like the mitochondria, they do a lot more work than we thought. We thought they were kind of the housekeepers. Turns out they also do a lot of cell-to-cell signaling, and they're doing computation at a lower, more fundamental level than the neurons are. The neurons get all the attention, but the mitochondria and the glial cells are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So what they saw here, so this is in an Alzheimer's brain, that when they did a 40 hertz stimulation through the eye, so a 40 hertz flickering light, we got changes in the morphology of the microglia. So they went from being kind of shrunk, compacted, not doing their job, to spread out doing their job simply by putting a 40 hertz flicker into the eye. And a series of other changes that came just from, again, talking to the brain in a language that it understands, that just said, hey, I need these parts to be doing this. So we can reduce amyloid plaque load in a dementia or Parkinson's model by using a 40 hertz flickering. So many, and this is just like scraping the very, very surface of when we use neurotherapy, how we can engage the whole psychophysical being, the information processing, body, brain, mind, to help to bring it back into its endogenous normal sense of its internal logic, right? Its own information processing system, so that the signals that are happening are being communicated into a system that can understand them, make sense of them, and self-regulate around them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fran. Go as long as you want. We got time.
Okay. I'm going to stand here for a minute and see if I'm in the right spot. Perfect. All right. I'm like, perfect. That's a score. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I'm probably going to truncate what I was going to talk about just for the sake of time. But we've kind of talked about the body in regards to chronic illness. Guy spent a good amount of time talking about research having to do with the brain and how the brain's functioning. I want to bring in the psyche to this conversation. And in particular, what I want to talk about is what happens to identity when somebody experiences chronic illness. So I'm going to talk with you about this idea of kind of how our identity tends to be based, and there's cultural factors that play a role here, but certainly in our country, our identity is often built on the assumption that our body is a reliable partner for us, right? And so that changes when chronic illness happens. It no longer is reliable in the way that we thought it was, and that can have a profound psychological impact on us, kind of leaving this sense of an identity gap. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some of the research in this area, but really kind of try to make it just very applicable. So there's a sociologist named Michael Burry who did kind of the core of his work back in the 80s, which sounds like forever ago, but he's still kind of, his thoughts on this are still part of the gold standard of thinking about how chronic illness impacts identity. And so Burry really talks about this idea of a biographical disruption, and really what he's talking about is a change in like your idea, this life story that you have, that perception that you have of not only who you are, but who you are headed to being, right? That idea. So you go from this place of, being this person with this semi-predictable future, right? You have an idea about where you want to go. And when the chronic illness occurs, that predictable future can get fractured and leave you in this chronic state of uncertainty, right, in terms of identity. And we all know that uncertainty, that state, if we're in it for very long, leads to anxiety, right? And that becomes kind of a pretty nasty feedback loop that can happen. So this illness kind of strips away the pillars of your identity. So you might go from, and this is where culture comes into play. In our culture, like our identity is really based on what we do, right? That's it. Every time you meet somebody, the first question out of their mouth is, what do you do? Not who are you, right? Not even what your interests are necessarily, but what do you do, right? And so we grow based on that idea, right? And that's how our identity shapes. It's our career, it's our role in our family, it's our role in friendships. I'm a caregiver. Those sorts of things become kind of what we build our identity on. And then when the chronic illness happens, your identity starts to shift because of the need you have to put all of your resources into managing symptoms, into managing energy or depletion of energy. That identity starts to shift into that of patient, right? I am a patient of chronic illness, of long COVID, of, fill in the blank there, right? And so Burry talks about this idea of that identity being fractured in a way that leads to grief, right? And the mourning of, again, not only the mourning of who you are, but also who you were intending to be as you look at your future. And if you look at the literature on this, the idea about the grief, they talk a lot about, like, the grief is not, it's not only like important to process, but necessary if you want to move to the place of integration of a new identity. New identity does not necessarily mean I'm not who I was at all. It just means that you integrate the losses and the new ways of being into how you see yourself, so that your psyche can start to develop that kind of stable sense again of who you are. The idea that the invisible illness, when we talk about long COVID, we talk about ME, CFS, we talk about fibromyalgia, all kinds of those kind of chronic illnesses. One of the major problems with them is that they're invisible. I remember driving into a parking lot in this was, oh gosh, this is years ago. I won't tell you when because just date me. But I was riding with somebody and we drove into a parking lot at a store. I don't know if it was a Cub Foods or something like that. And a woman was parking in the handicap lot and it had a handicap sticker and was getting out of the car and didn't have any real visible disability, right? And the person that was driving the car I was in said, how did they get a handicap sticker? What did they lie about, right? And I was like, what? But it was that idea that when we don't see it, we don't recognize it, right? And one of the things that the research shows is how that invisibility of the illness can really weaponize this uncertainty and skepticism. We know that happens with medical practitioners who are skeptical and other people in the lives of the individual with chronic illness who may have skepticism. But what the research has shown is that when that starts to occur, for the individual with the chronic illness, they start to take on that skepticism toward themselves and they start to doubt themselves as well, right? And so then that creates difficulty being able to tell people what symptoms I'm experiencing when you go to a practitioner, because maybe I'm really not. Maybe that's just me psychologically thinking I'm feeling that, and all of that kind of thing can start to happen. And it can really become kind of a mind mess for people. So this is, I really appreciate this slide in terms of how it really shows the wreckage of a broken life plan, right? This is who I thought I was going to be. And then I suddenly have this sense of like, I don't know what life is about for me. I don't understand the meaning of my life anymore because I really don't know who I am now because I've lost that sense, right? And so the idea of being able to kind of regain that is part of what becomes crucial here. And it's a big piece that is missed oftentimes because we're so focused on what's going on with the physical end of things and the anxiety pieces of things that we forget about the psyche and what the psyche is doing and how it has been injured as well. To add to, there's a couple of other theorists, I'm just going to pull this up just for the sake of time, that I wanted to pull in to kind of complement what Burry talks about. So Burry's kind of looking at that idea of kind of social, focusing on the social and practical break in the future, the storyline of who I am. If we go over to Javi Correll over there, Javi's really talking about the idea of the world that I'm in no longer makes sense to me in the way it did. I want to back up once and just show you this. This is what Carell is really pointing to, is that idea that a staircase no longer is a staircase in my world, it's a barrier, right? Because the idea of getting up those 5 stairs seems near impossible, right? And so my whole physical world has now changed in terms of how I perceive it. And so my world starts to shrink, right? Because now those stairs, not in it for me, right? I used to be able to do them without even thinking about them. Now that's not a part of my world anymore, right? That long hallway, nope, not going to do it unless there's a chair in the middle that I can find to sit down. Those sorts of things. And then if you add Kathy Sharmaz's contributions into it, she really kind of focused on the idea of how that loss of identity impacts worth. Right? And the idea of being able to kind of do the internal grief that you need to do so that you can get to a place where your worth is not based on what you do, because that's what your identity was previously, right? But rather start to be based on who I am in this moment, right? And that's what we know self-worth to be anyway, but when it's been kind of bastardized by culture, worth looks like something very different than that. So this is just an example of how this might play out for a client, right? So this is a 38-year-old high school teacher. She had aspirations, kind of a 10-year plan to become a principal and kind of move her career in that trajectory. She's also a marathon runner. Developed long COVID and ME CFS following a viral infection, right? And so suddenly she found herself in a place where she had profound post-exertional malaise, right? So a little bit of energy and she was just wiped, right? And a lot of struggle with, part of what Guy was talking about, with central sensitization. She had a lot of difficulty with sensory overload. And so pre-illness, this was a woman whose identity was, I'm energetic, I'm upwardly mobile, I have physical endurance, right? And then her current reality is focused on this physical restriction that I have, the energy depletion that I have, and that's who I am, right? So you can imagine the psychological toll that starts to take, right? And then if you add into that the idea that in order to deal with that psychological toll, you're going to need to do some work, right? Some cognitive work on that, some looking into what your belief systems were and how you might work on changing some of those. And so the idea being that the goal here would be to help somebody develop and integrate their identity to include both the losses that they've had and where they are currently, and to be able to kind of get to a place where that feels to them like a stable identity. That takes a lot of work. And it takes the capacity for a brain to be able to help you access your frontal lobes and manage your emotional regulation in a way that can allow you to do that work. And so this kind of comes back full circle to what Guy was talking about with that last slide when he was talking with us about what we do in terms of neurotherapy and neuroimaging is really looking at the impact of what a chronic illness does on the brain. Both the doctors and Guy were talking about inflammation in the brain and the issues that can happen with that in terms of depleting like neural signals, like literally slowing neural messages down, shutting down the prefrontal cortex that is the part of that holds like our executive functioning, tasking, and those sorts of things, and emotion management kinds of processes in it. And as those get impacted by chronic illness, it just makes it more difficult to be able to do the identity work, right? And so the idea being here that I'm going to move forward in here, that if you start to regulate the brain, if you start to manage the inflammation and reduce it, if you start to kind of get some of that neural signaling to work more optimally, that the brain is going to start, again, doing the things that it could do and allowing the person to be able to kind of do some of that growth work in terms of kind of integrating the identity. The process will be slow because requires energy, but it can happen once the brain has an opportunity to start to regulate itself. And so Guy talked about kind of the different areas that we kind of deal with in the clinic. I think in terms of when I think about what's going on with a brain in chronic illness, the areas that we work with mostly would be neurofeedback, which is a way to kind of work on, through a process of operant conditioning, to work on regulating both networks in the brain, but also like, with chronic autonomic nervous system, on hyperdrive, to be able to work on regulating some of the areas of the brain that contribute to the autonomic regulation as well. Neurofeedback can be really helpful in that regard as well. It can be helpful in reducing inflammation. It can be a great resource for sleep regulation as well. I'm not going to play this video. I'm going to scoot through it. It's a video of somebody doing neurofeedback, and we just don't have time for it, so I'm not going to do it tonight. One of the other things that can be really helpful here is photobiomodulation, so infrared light. Guy touched on inflammation again, that sort of thing. Infrared light can be really helpful. When you think about the amount of the slowing down of the neural processing that happens with chronic illness, infrared light can be really helpful with that. So kind of like an ideal situation would be do a little bit of infrared on the brain, right after that do some neurofeedback, and then follow that, or at the same time as you're doing the infrared, you could be doing this audiovisual entrainment, which is a way to kind of start to get the brain to create particular brainwave frequencies, kind of create a state of that. So I think of somebody who might be, have a lot of anxiety happening, and to be able to run a slower brainwave frequency, maybe an alpha frequency, that really kind of gets the brain to start to produce more of that and to calm. And it can be a great, really great way to get somebody into a state of meditation when they don't have the energy to do the meditation, right? Which is a thing that we see happen oftentimes with chronic illness. So the whole idea here is, right, to restore that sense of identity, and to do that through a process of addressing the brain. My thought about this always is like what we were talking about earlier, what the doctors were talking about, the TEND method, that when the brain is regulated, all of those things that you're doing with clients they go much smoother because the brain actually has the ability to do the tasking that we're asking it to do. Sometimes we think about, like, even a meditation, we might think about it as like, well, the brain's just shutting down, right? Which is not what's happening at all. And it takes energy for the brain to do that, right? And so kind of addressing it at the brain level can really improve the brain's ability to do all of those things. And when you can get a person to start engaging in, like, everything that you talked about with the tending method, it's going to have a positive impact on their psyche as well, because it's moving them into that place of being able to add in those new pieces of information to integrate them into this is who I am, right? Yeah. All right. Thank you for your time. Those of you that are online, Sherry, I know you had a question that we have for the doctors here, so if you wanted to come up here so that you're a little closer to the microphone, that would be fantastic. And Guy can maybe read the question that Sherry had.
Good question about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and how that factors in. So that's part of her question.
It's really actually a question that I hold because I have some family history there. So I'm exploring that right now, but I don't have a good answer for it. I'm in exploration. Do you have an experience with Ehlers-Danlos?
I do in that, in my private practice, we collectively treat lots of people who are on that spectrum of hypermobility. And so that spectrum of hypermobility is very closely related to many of the things that we're seeing in long COVID. We don't have enough data yet to know if there's a higher incidence of these kinds of illnesses. At least I have not seen that data, but definitely there is a higher incidence of things like mast cell activation syndrome and leaky gut syndrome, food sensitivity. So that sort of immune dysregulation is definitely present in people who have hypermobility because it basically is making all of the connective tissue a little too loosey-goosey. So that causes all manner of systems to go awry.
At every level.
At every level,
Right, yeah.
yes. So that's my nutshell response.
Okay. All right.
So I'll say the same thing. So I didn't mention Ehlers-Danlos when I listed off things.
Yeah.
It again can be kind of its own occurring, in a very kind of limited and specific way, although it tends not to be. And even if it starts there, it's usually that person's entry point into the cascade that is leading them. And so I often, when I encounter that person, they're they're in the central sensitization category, even if that's their main complaint. But I'll say, so you guys talked about how that soft tissue change can throw things off from that information processing kind of from the body up, right? So the body is always looking for certainty, and when joints are unstable, there's no certainty, and then that throws that whole predictive processing that I was talking about off. But there's some good new research showing kind of reversing it, looking at the brain and how anxiety, dysregulating the brain, is creating the disinformation that's going to the joints. And so if we regulate it at the level of the brain, we can actually see joint function return to normal.
More stability?
More stability, because now the joint is getting the proper information where before it was getting misinformation. So there's very new research. I mean, maybe a couple of years into it. But the now that they're like, rather than, so for, I've been doing this treating for 35 years, all 25 years, I was treating something like Ehlers-Danlos from the body.
Sure.
Because that's what I thought it was. It's like, people's like, no, this hurts right here, and this hurts, and this hurts.
It's dislocated here, yeah.
And so, you know, using, again, bioelectric medicine or maybe massage or whatever, but treating peripherally. Well, now there's this idea of you could treat centrally. So we've just started, but the folks doing this research are a few years ahead, and they're seeing really good results in being able to turn the disease around by regulating the brain and letting the brain re-regulate what's happening in the body. So yeah, so it's absolutely, so this is one of my new favorite areas is Ehlers-Danlos.
And the next step of the question would be then, so if you do that, do you decrease the amount of genetic transmission to the next generation by stopping by stopping the presentation at the neural level?
Great question,
There.
right? So epigenetics.
Yeah, that'll probably
Right.
happen after our lifetime, but it would be really fascinating to know.
So then there's a part B though to Sherry's question. So you guys might want to step up. So and there was just a question around like how ACEs, the adverse childhood, kind of factors in to this. And so all of us kind of mentioned trauma, but I don't think we really stopped and talked about it.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so that was just part of the question. So I didn't know if either of you wanted to say a little something about
Well,
what you see.
yeah, well, I mean, obviously, certainly ACEs or adverse childhood, events are huge traumas, right? And so that applies to any of the places that we talked about trauma. And I think it probably from a level of damage, if you will, because it's at so much of more of a foundational level when it happens in youth. I think it kind of amplifies the whole impact of the traumatic thing. And I think too often practitioners, if it's not your area of work, it's just not first in your mind to think about. And some of these illnesses can bring those things up, and practitioners may not even be looking to recognize that that's part of what's happening. But Michelle?
Mm-hmm. I guess what I would add to that is we talked about earlier the higher incidence of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder in people who have long COVID specifically, but also there's a relatively high incidence in ME/CFS as well, and I think in a lot of chronic pain type conditions. I think to me what's most interesting about that, specifically if we're talking about ACEs and childhood trauma, is that children then are sort of programmed into a bit of a hypervigilant place as a child. That becomes their norm before anything else happens. They're primed. That's their normal state. And so you ask a person whose normal state is a high alert, hypervigilant, watching because they have to, you ask that person then to calm down, relax, meditate. These people actually don't like that, right? Like that's a very uncomfortable state. So to me, it seems very clear that that creates a dysregulated immune system. That seems like very clear. So I'm really interested in this possibility of helping to retrain people's nervous systems so that what has for all their lives felt like that's their normal and that's safe, to be able to change that story. Because I think to do it in a talk therapy, mental health space, now we know it really takes forever or doesn't ever work. Right? So this is a really exciting thing.
Yeah.
So that's my very long-winded response.
Perfect. So I'll add in my sense. So I like that, going back to early childhood development, we go back all the way to in utero, that the neurotransmitters, the biochemical neurotransmitters, that system kind of gets turned on its head. There's like overproduction of the neurotransmitters we really don't want to have much of, and underproduction of the ones we do want. So we kind of switch that from the beginning. I mentioned in my answer to Sherry, one of our clinical mentors, Dirk de Ritter, and his work on trauma in the brain. And he's developed a fantastic model looking at how the pain network and the suffering network kind of join up in this idea. And then particularly kind of his idea of PTSD and kind of PTSD versus not PTSD, having to do with how the network of networks has been changed, which goes right to the thing that you were saying, which is somebody who has PTSD, like the last thing we want to do is ask them to meditate, right? And it just, in a sense, what Dirk has been able to show is that the switch that in a non-PTSD person, the way the networks route, if you go into the default mode network, that's an internal mind wandering kind of offline, and that's what a neurotypical person would find calming, relaxing, resourcing. Whereas somebody who has PTSD and that switch has flipped, if they start to go into that, they're going to have an anxiety attack, right? Because that's the thing that their brain has said, that's dangerous, you can't do that. And there's this flipping of it though, right? Because it's when you're supposed to be kind of like in the salience place, that person can go into the defaults, they go offline. So when they're supposed to be paying attention, they check out. When they're supposed to check out because everything is fine, they're hypervigilant. The switch is backward. For Fran and I, this has been a huge understanding. And now when we have somebody come in that shows the signs, has the history of, of PTSD, we'll start right there with rewiring that circuitry so that their brain can take in the things that are supposed to help them relax. We'll take somebody with PTSD and put them into just like an HRV breathing and take them into what should be their optimal happy place. And before they get there, they'll have a panic attack, right? It's because the system is biased towards not moving. And so helping to rewire that circuit, and then the things that should have been working start working. Yeah.
That's the point I want to make sure
Yeah.
to state is that therapy can help.
Yes.
But that has to happen.
Exactly. Because you can have people do all of the right things for decades and get no results. Why? Because the circuit is backwards. If we fix the circuit, then all of those things can help. And so that's just part of what we found in looking at, again, this idea of information processing. So I wanted to say that, so one of the things that happens, again, just to the point the two of you were making, is when we have that, kind of early trauma, and again, early childhood stuff tends to be chronic. It's not an incident, series of it. If we look at the neurotransmitters around a synaptic cleft in the brain, what we find is the mix of those, that mix of neurochemicals sitting there when action potentials go back and forth, are not the same as in a neurotypical person. So just when their synapses fire, just the communication from this neuron to this neuron is different because the information that's coding it is different. So just wired right in from electrochemical is information that isn't supposed to be there, right? And so that's part of the challenge. And again, what we found is, say, doing something like neuromodulation, we can start to kind of strain out those neurotransmitters of trauma, so that synaptic cleft is getting cleansed, so that the signals that are going through it are tagged with less misinformation. And so, anyways, lots and lots and lots and lots to be said. And I can see this really should be like a summit. Like we need a weekend summit because there's just so much to be talked about in all of this. So I think that was, Sherry had like maybe one more comment at the end, or was that the end of it?
She just had a brief something what we're saying.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sherry. Thank you for your questions. Brilliant. And thank you for everybody online joining us tonight. It was great to have you and chat with you, and we hope to see you in person next time. All right.
That was wonderful, thank you.
Did I answer my questions?